Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So here we are, Shabbat, before Election Day in this country, just days away from the official Election Day. And if I had to sum up the word that captures where we all are at this moment on this Shabbat, the word is shpilkis. We are all on incredible shpilkis right now. We are stressed, we are worried and uncertain about what's going to happen. What is Tuesday going to look like? What is the world going to look like next Shabbos when we're together here? Is there going to be any results from the election itself, or is something we don't know? And what makes it so difficult for all of us is the stakes are so high. And the truth is we're all very much hurting right now because there's so much that can be lost in this election. Luckily for us, we have Parshas Lech Lecha. We have the Parsha to give us insight. And God willing, that's what I hope to do today, to use some insights from our Parsha to help ground us at this moment of terrible insecurity and uncertainty, to give us something to ground us and something that we can count on. So Parshat Lech Lecha begins with the famous words, Lech lecha u'me'artzecha mi'moladitcha mi'beit avicha el ha'aretz asher ha'eka. God says to Avram, go from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. One of the most remarkable moments in all of the Torah, particularly because Avram is just a random character who appears in the story here. And God calls to him, tells him to pick up and leave, and he listens to God and he goes, even though he's never known God before and he doesn't know where he's going. So that's what is fascinating. Why is it that Avram was able to trust in the voice of God calling to him and to go, but not even know where he was heading? How could he do something so random? When I teach kids, like, kids in school, I'll go over the Parsha with them on this, and I'll say, what would you do if suddenly this voice boomed out from the heavens and said, go leave your house and go somewhere, but I'm not going to tell you where? What would you do? And the kids all say, I would say you're crazy, right? So would we all. So what was it about Avram that enabled him to face the unknown so profoundly with such unshaking faith that he was going somewhere good and right? The medieval commentator Nachmanides points out something very interesting. He points out that this call that Avram gets in our Parsha isn't actually out of the blue. It actually has precedence in the story. In fact, the end of last week's Parsha, we read the story of Avram's father, Terach, who apparently took his whole family and everyone with him from Ur Kasdim and started out on a journey where? To none other than to Canaan, to the land of Israel. But the story goes that he made it only to Haran, which is in Iraq, and got no further. So there are many who wonder, maybe the one who was originally called wasn't Avram, but it was his father. His father got that call. And somehow his father got stuck in Haran. And what does the Midrash do? The Midrash brilliantly talks about not only did he get stuck, but he became an idol merchant. And we're all familiar with the famous story of how Avram was so frustrated with his father that he smashed his father's idols. That so poignantly captures how Avram knew that his father was capable of more, but his father failed him. So with this falling from the call of God and Avram's frustration with his father that we see in the Midrash, suddenly we have insight that he didn't go on this journey out of nowhere, but he was actually just completing the journey that his father meant to complete in his lifetime, but never made it. So that explains one piece about why he was going where he was going. But the other piece is still a missing piece, which is, why did he believe in God? Why is it that the character of God, when God calls to him, Avram, listened to God? And in the Midrash, we get a wonderful story that explains how he figured out that it was God telling him to go. This is from Breshit Rabbah. I'm going to read it to you. Rabbi Yitzchak said This may be compared to a man who was traveling from place to place when he saw a castle on fire. He said, "Why is it that it's on fire? Is it possible that this castle lacks a person to look after it?" The owner of the building looked out and said, "I am the owner of the castle." Similarly, because Abraham, our father, said, "Is it possible that this castle, this world, has no guide, no one to look after it?" The Holy One, blessed be he, looked out and said to him, "I am the master of the universe." Hence, God said to Avram, "Lech lecha." So this is an absolutely brilliant midrash, and I just want to unpack it for a moment. So not only is Avram extraordinary that he was capable of completing a journey that his father ought to have completed, but he's extraordinary because he was able to look deeply at his life. He was able to look not only at his own father's failure, but he was able to look around at his whole society, at the idolatrous society that he lived in, and all of the ways in which it was morally failing, and all the ways in which the world around him was a castle on fire. But implicit in the story is that it's a castle, it's a beautiful thing, it's a world that has so much potential, but it's failing, it's falling to corruption. And so it was his own yearning to say, who's in charge here, that led him to being aware that there is God. And this typology of capturing this as a castle on fire really is a way of showing us what Avram really was doing. He looked around at his own family and he looked around at his society in Haran, and he saw that there was injustice and corruption. And in response to that injustice, he said, this can't be how it ought to be. Who's in charge here? And he found God in that inquiry. What I particularly love about this midrash is that rather than making the character of God the way God appears in the story as this voice, this big boy in the sky voice that's booming down to Avram, you see the locus of where God's calling really comes from. It comes actually from within Avraham. It comes from within his own moral conscience, his own sensibility that this is not the way the world ought to be, but the world could be better than this. And that led him to an awareness of one singular source of moral authority in the world, and that inspired him to continue on the journey that his father began. So when we put all of this together, we see the extraordinary nature of Avram, that he was a man who saw the potential, saw the failure to live up to the potential, and decided to address it by picking up where his family before him started out, but never quite made it. This is a very powerful typology for us to think about when we think about this moment in history, this Shabbat before an incredibly fraught and powerful election in the history of this country. Because we look around at our society, and one of the lessons that we've had over the past several years in this country is the unbelievable disappointment we have in the failures and the moral failures of our society, in all of the ways in which we have fallen from the ideals of what we ought to be as an American society. And like Avram, who was disappointed in his father, many of us have become disappointed in our forefathers, in our American context and in our American story. We learn stories about, of course, many of the founding fathers of this country were slave owners. When they talked about the brotherhood of man and the equality of all men, and all men are created equal, they're just talking about white men. And we see the limitations of their vision of what this democracy could be. And it hurts. We see that this country isn't what it could be. And at the same time, they had a beautiful vision. Even though they were limited, they had an incredible vision of a more perfect union, of a democracy which has the potential to truly be for all people. But what's happened in this country? In the years of the Civil War and afterward, we got our own stuck in Haran, our own kind of Haran. We got stuck with the legacy of slavery, with racism, with bigotry. We got stuck bowing down to the idols of runaway capitalism and corruption and greed. And with the advent of the power of fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracy theories, we're experiencing a real moral rot of the core, of the moral heart and soul of our country and our democracy. We've been bearing witness to all of these incredible failures. So in many ways, this Shabbat and this week is our Lech Lecha moment. Like Avram, we're here looking around at our world and we see the failures everywhere. But our Jewish tradition is calling us to, as Avraham did, to see, even with all of these failures, going back to our founding fathers, there is a kernel of a vision of something beautiful, of something powerful, of something good and just for all human beings. It lives in potential in our society. We've just fallen from that ideal as a people, as a country. And so the castle is on fire, right? And I want to come back to something I talked about on the High Holy Days. It was the quote of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese peace activist. He talked about when your house is on fire, remember I said this? You can either spend your time running after the arsonist or you could put out the fire. That's what Avram did with his castle on fire, right? He decided to find who owned the castle and to join with the owner of that castle and work to put out that fire, because the castle is worth saving. And even though Avram did leave behind his father's house and his country and walked away from everything, he didn't entirely walk away from everything. He didn't burn everything down and start again. He took the potential that lived in his own father, in his own family, and built on that. And he moved forward, creating a better world through his example and his journey and his actions. So if there's any lesson that comes to us from our time, it's don't give up. Don't give up no matter what happens. Don't give up. There are already many reasons why we might want to despair with what's happening in the Supreme Court and the judiciary of this country. Many of us are afraid and we're despairing about the rights of women now, the rights of those who have pre-existing conditions, what's going to happen to our healthcare in our society, what's going to happen to the rights of people in the LGBTQ community, what's going to happen to whatever progress we have made in terms of racial justice in this society. There is a lot of reasons to be afraid that there's already a time to despair, but it's not. That's the lesson of Lech Lecha. I want to read a quote from the Sfat Emet, who talks about this moment of Lech Lecha. He says the following. He says, Lech Lecha me'artzecha, get you out of your land. A person should always keep walking to that which I will show you. Always some new attainment. This is why a person is called a walker. Whoever stands still is not renewed, for nature holds him fast. The angels above and beyond nature, and they are beyond nature, they are the only ones who can be said to stand. But we are human beings. We are a person, and a person has to keep walking. So, what I would say to us, if you haven't already voted on this Tuesday, I don't use this phrase very often, but for the love of God, for what we mean by God in Judaism, get out there and vote. Walk forward, keep walking. As Abraham Joshua Heschel said, pray with your feet and keep walking forward. And no matter what happens in this election, no matter who wins this election, we have our charge as the Jewish people to keep walking forward. If it means marching in Washington for the sake of those who are the most vulnerable and at risk, then we will keep marching forward. We have to keep walking forward for the sake of all of our ancestors who came to this country in search of a better life and the promise that this country held out for them. We have to do that for ourselves and most importantly for our children and for our children's children. We must keep walking forward no matter what happens, because we have a promise from Parshat Lech Lecha that if we keep walking forward, that you shall become a great nation. I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. It's true, there is a lot that's unknown about what's going to happen this week, but from a Jewish perspective, there's no ultimate mystery here. We already know what we have to do. We have to remember the potential that began with our ancestors, and we have to keep walking forward. And in our journey forward, may we indeed be a blessing. And let us all say, Amen.